I'll start off by introducing DEQ's team associated with the Dresser facility. They include Roger Jingles, the Assistant Secretary of the Office of Environmental Assessment, Estuardo Silva, Administrator of the Remediation Division, myself, Kerry DeSherry, Geologist Manager, Paula Sen, Geologist and Team Leader for this Dresser facility, Brandon Williams, our Regional Attorney, and Dr. June Sutherland, Toxicologist. It is important to understand that DEQ does not conduct environmental assessments. We do not have drill rigs or drilling crews to operate those rigs. DEQ dictates and directs environmental investigations which are paid for by potentially responsible parties. When a chemical release occurs, the responsible party is financially liable for cleanup costs. Our environmental regulations spell out how all investigations are to take place at all facilities in the state. We require facilities to hire environmental consultants and subcontractors that DEQ works with to design and approve an environmental investigation to determine the nature and extent of environmental contamination. All work performed by consultants must be approved by the department. That process involves drilling and sampling environmental media, including groundwater, surface water, sediments, and air, to collect information in order to determine where the contamination is, what the possible source of that contamination is, and once it's delineated, how it will ultimately be remediated. Depending on the nature and extent of the release and the complexity of the geology, the investigation to determine the extent of contamination may require years to complete. After the extent of contamination is determined, the responsible party must submit remedies to clean up that contamination. The selection and implementation of the cleanup method must be approved by the department. Cleanup is required to be continued until contamination is reduced to levels determined to be protective of human health and the environment as defined by DEQ regulation. Remediation of groundwater often requires years to complete. DEQ must approve the success of a remedy before the responsible party can discontinue the remediation efforts. The DEQ meets regularly with the responsible parties and their environmental consultants to direct where additional information needs to be collected and to adequately complete the delineation process. Now to discuss the remediation process as it relates to the Dresser facility, which is located at 8011 Shreveport Highway in Pineville, Louisiana. In this particular case, the department was notified of a total petroleum hydrocarbon detection in groundwater at a single location on site in the summer of 2012. The site was assigned a DEQ team leader to oversee all activities, who directed Dresser to submit a work plan to delineate that detection. Once the work plan was submitted to the department and the department was satisfied with the work to be conducted, Dresser scheduled that work to be completed by contracting with a drilling contractor. The initial soil and groundwater investigation was completed on site, and once the sample results were obtained from an environmental lab, a final report was put together and submitted to the department. The report, which was reviewed by DEQ, indicated the contaminant was a chlorinated hydrocarbon, trichloroethylene, commonly referred to as TCE, rather than a petroleum hydrocarbon as originally reported. TCE was detected in the delineation borings which were completed. Based on those results, Dresser was instructed to continue sampling outward from the source area to find the outer edge of the groundwater plume. We refer to this process as delineation. Dresser was also instructed to determine the likely source of the contamination and to determine groundwater flow direction of the groundwater plume. The process of determining the extent of contamination is an iterative process. Once contamination is discovered, new samples are taken at locations distant from the area of known contamination. This process continues until the locations sampled are found to be clean, indicating the edge of the contamination has been identified. Because this process requires repetitive steps, it is not uncommon for environmental assessments to take years to complete, depending on the nature and size of the contaminated groundwater plume and the complexity of the geology in the area. Once it was determined that groundwater and salt gas contamination had reached the Aurora Park subdivision and posed a potential exposure risk, the entire subdivision and areas along Shreveport Highway were issued notification letters indicating that environmental contamination was discovered in the vicinity of their homes that could potentially cause unacceptable exposure risks. The discovery and notification took place between December of 2019 and February 2020. LDEQ issues two types of public notices. The triggering event for Public Notice 1 is when the department becomes aware of information and determines that a release is likely to have off-site impacts that exceed the applicable federal or state health and safety standard and pose a significant risk of adverse health effects. A public notice is provided when an emergency or exigent circumstance exists. Notice shall be given as soon as practicable under the circumstances by using any reasonable means or otherwise within 30 days of the triggering event. The triggering event at the Dresser site was the discovery of groundwater and/or salt gas contamination in the vicinity of residences that could potentially result in unacceptable exposure. In January 2020, DEQ began issuing first notifications to adjacent residents. To date, first notifications have been issued to the Aurora Park subdivision in adjacent areas along Shreveport Highway, the Timber Trails area, Jennifer's Place area, the Greystone area north of Shreveport Highway, and areas along Highway 167 and Cayley Road north of the facility. The triggering event for public notice number 2 is when the department confirms off-site impact that exceeds the applicable federal or state health and safety standard, and the department determines that the off-site impact poses a significant risk of adverse health effects. A public notice is provided when an emergency or exigent circumstance exists. A notice shall be given as soon as practicable under the circumstances by using any reasonable means or otherwise within 30 days of the triggering event. Indoor air results exceeding the health-based standard served as the triggering event for public notice number 2. The health-based standards for indoor air are 2.1 micrograms per cubic meter TCE and 3.8 micrograms per cubic meter of PCE. DEQ began issuing second notifications to residents in March of 2020. The investigation has been expedited such that Dresser has contracted with an additional environmental consultant to conduct air sampling while keeping an environmental drilling contractor on site full-time to obtain groundwater and salt gas data. They have also expedited lab turnaround time to get preliminary results in faster to speed up the assessment activities and response actions. Indoor air sampling is ongoing. Mitigation measures are being implemented as needed, such as air purifiers, I-wave, and sub-slab depressurization systems. Remediation began in the source area in 2018 through a process known as in situ chemical oxidation reduction, which is the injection of an oxidant, sodium permanganate in this instance, to chemically break down the TCE. Groundwater delineation activities continue to this day, although the majority of the area has been determined. data gaps are being filled now, along with one area to the northwest of the facility in Grant Parish. Additional remediation measures have also been implemented at the source area presently and will be expanded off-site, which include a solid vapor extraction system, also known as an SVE system, which basically recovers solid vapors and treats those vapors on site. Additional information on the investigation can be found in LDEQ's electronic data management system by following the link seen on the screen. The information on Dresser is filed under Agency Interest Number 2920. There are over 200 entries pertaining to remedial activities at the Dresser facility from 2012 to 2020. To summarize DEQ's role in the response actions, the department has taken the lead in directing the investigation and remedial activities. We've reviewed, provided input to, and approved the sampling work plans. DEQ staff have provided daily oversight of the investigation. We've reviewed data conducted for groundwater, solid vapor, indoor air, and ambient air samples, and the DEQ team has participated in weekly investigation update meetings with Dresser and Louisiana Department of Health. As discussed earlier, the department has provided notification to residents, addressed community concerns, and answered questions via phone and email, provided the community with information on the investigation online through DEQ's Dresser website and through the electronic data management system. We've updated local officials and attended police jury meetings in both Rapides and Grant Parish. Following the Dresser investigation update, DEQ and LDH will address community questions and concerns. In closing, the department thought it might be beneficial to explain some of the technical terms that you'll see in our maps and our data tables in EDMS. For groundwater, the units indicated are micrograms per liter, or parts per billion, which is represented by 1 cent in $10 million, or 1 second in 32 years. The groundwater standard for TCE is 5 micrograms per cubic liter, or 5 ppb. For PCE, the groundwater standard is also 5 micrograms per cubic liter. The air units are expressed as micrograms per cubic meter. A cubic meter is equal to 1,000 liters. It applies to indoor air, outdoor air, and solid vapor. The indoor air standard for TCE is 2.1 micrograms per cubic meter, and for PCE, the standard is 3.8 micrograms per cubic meter. TCE again refers to trichloroethylene, and PCE is also known as tetrachloroethylene, sometimes referred to as perchloroethylene and even shortened to PERC. Thank you.
I'm Dr. David Holcomb, and I am the Regional Administrator and Medical Director for the Office of Public Health, and I'm here to give you some information about the current work being done at the Dresser site. And there are 3 groups that are working in this through the Louisiana Department of Health, and those are the Office of Public Health itself and the Section of Environmental Epidemiology and Toxicology, also known as SEAT, and the Safe Drinking Water Program. Next slide, please. So LDH has a complex role in this. And part of the role is to coordinate with the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality. They're also tasked to review sample results, which are obtained through these various testing. They have access to subject matter experts, notably for vapor intrusion, from the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, which is actually a part of CDC. And they also are working with the Safe Drinking Water Program. The community concerns can be submitted through a toll-free number, which is not shown here, but is 888-293-7020. Next slide, please. So this is all about something called trichloroethylene, or TCE. And this is a colorless, non-flammable, sweet-smelling substance, which is actually a solvent. And this is used as a degreaser, notably for industrial equipment, but is also found in dry cleaning products, in spot removers, and paint strippers, glues, adhesives. It is a very potent solvent. It is also has some breakdown products that are tetrachloroethylene, which we won't talk much about. Next slide, please. So what is this all about? So TCE can get into the environment from where it's being used, in this case in an industrial site. And if it is open in the air, if it's spilled on the surface, then it will break down quickly in the presence of light and oxygen. So it just evaporates and is more or less destroyed. The problem is that TCE can get into the soil, and it goes down there, and of course there is no light and no oxygen, and so it can remain for a very long time. And it can infiltrate into groundwater and potentially pose a problem for public drinking water wells if they are shallow. It also can evaporate up through the surface, and then it can get into houses through cracks in the foundations and pipes, and that's called vapor intrusion. So this little drawing here doesn't really represent the site because, as you know, most people here don't have basements. And the other thing is, more importantly, is that the wells, the drinking wells in this area are much, much deeper than where the TCE is located currently. Next. So from a public perspective, there's a couple of concerns. And of course, people want to know if the drinking water is safe. And as mentioned, the aquifers, or where the water is migrating, that are used for drinking water in this area are much, much deeper than where this product has been located. So the public wells have all been tested, and they found to be below minimum detectable limits. So this is considered what they call non-detect. So the drinking water is safe, and it continues to be monitored in a regular way by the Drinking Water Program. There are no superficial private wells in that area, which would be subject to contamination. Next slide. So what is going on? So they have been testing, trying to figure out the maximum depth and the superficial area where this TCE has spread about, and people in the area have seen these wells that have gone down. And the other part of this is indoor air quality. So they've tested in these subdivisions there of Aurora Park, Timber Trails, and Gray Stone, which are found near where the contamination occurred. And those places are subject to indoor air monitoring. And so there's equipment that's brought in that will actually determine the level of TCE that may be in the air. in residences at or near this site. Next slide, please. So what is TCE's effect on health? Well, TCE is not a good thing because it has a number of health effects. And if you, these are usually effects that are related to high exposures that can occur in people that work with it industrially, which is not the case. So if you were exposed to it as a product, it might give you headaches or dizziness or sleepiness. But the levels that are detected in the homes in the Pineville area are well below the concentrations that have been shown to cause these sorts of effects. Now, there are long-term effects that are related to the immune system, and it actually, TCE at very high concentrations for prolonged exposures can cause kidney cancer, liver cancer, malignant lymphomas, and a number of cancers. And this is also particularly relevant to pregnant women because it is classified as a carcinogen, which means it can affect the fetus. So it is important to know if people have been exposed, and more importantly, how much and for how long. So it can affect your health, but is probably not affecting health in the concentrations that are currently being detected in and around the Dresser plant. Next. So from a homeowner perspective, the question would be, how can I reduce the risk of exposure? So you're not going to get it through the water. And some homes which have been tested with indoor air testing, will have higher levels. And so you want to ensure adequate ventilation in your homes. And that means, adequate airflow, but also sealing cracks in the foundations where the TCA vapors may intrude. If your home has been identified for vapor intrusion sampling, please let them come in and sample. And if they find levels that are high or higher, then they will offer air purifying systems to you. And those are very, very effective. And they can drop levels down by 5 or 10 times to levels that are, again, nearly undetectable. So this is more or less the information, the basic information that we're providing to the public in the area. Next. There's some contact information for the SEAT, which is the section of environmental epidemiology and toxicology, and to myself, Dr. David Holcomb. I am not a specialist in toxicology, but I am familiar with the area, and I have gotten a lot of information from those individuals who are involved in this project. Thank you very much for your attention, and there will be questions and answers after the presentations.
Good evening. My name is John Ellis. I'm a geologist with GHD Consultants, and I'm part of a broader team working on the Dresser Pineville project in Pineville, Louisiana. I'd like to thank the Louisiana Department of Health and the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality for the opportunity to provide an update on our activities at the site. I'd also like to thank the elected officials who we've worked with. That would be Mr. Gabe Ferment, Mr. Mike Johnson, Bubba Morrow, and many others. Their continued support is important to our efforts. I'd also like to thank the community in this area for their help in our assessment. So tonight we'll look at a few of the activities that's been ongoing and provide you with information on our assessment and remediation. Briefly, the site here depicted on the right is located in Pineville, Louisiana. The Dresser facility manufactured pressure relief valves, maintained and repaired those. As part of that process, chlorinated solvents were used. Specifically, a chemical TCE, trichloroethylene, was used at the site. Through operations, Some of that material was released and has affected the on-site groundwater and some of the groundwater in the area around the facility. In response, Dresser assembled a broad team of environmental professionals and tasked them to fully evaluate conditions at the facility and in the surrounding community. We are committed to making certain that all conditions are completely understood and addressed in accordance with appropriate state and federal environmental, health, and safety rules and guidance. There is no impact to the public's drinking water systems. We currently have assessment, monitoring, and remediation underway. We are also assessing vapor intrusion in the area as a result of our work. And I would like to thank the community for their assistance in us performing these activities during this COVID-19 issue. Dresser has committed all of the necessary resources to fully understand the groundwater, soil gas, and indoor air conditions on and near the site. A little bit more about the assessment activities we have conducted to date. The figure on the right depicts the locations where we have collected soil, groundwater, indoor air, and ambient air or outside air samples. I want to emphasize that these dots you see on the map simply indicate where samples have been taken and don't necessarily mean that TCE has been found there. If you live near these areas, you may have seen our field crews doing their work. To date, we have installed 95 monitor wells to look for the presence of TCE. We have also installed 156 soil vapor monitoring points. Additionally, 65 homes have been assessed for vapor intrusion. We will discuss these in a little more detail in a second. Again, I would like to thank the DEQ and Department of Health for their cooperation in this process. Depicted here is a conceptual model of our assessment activities. We look for groundwater, for the TCE in groundwater. Depicted here on the figure is an area that contains TCE in the blue shading. We use the monitor wells to routinely collect groundwater samples to look for the presence of TCE. TCE is a volatile compound and can vaporize from the groundwater when present. So as shown on the figure, these vapors can rise through the soil. We monitor that through the use of vapor monitoring points as depicted here. Once we identify the location of groundwater, TCE in groundwater, and the TCE in a soil vapor sample, we will then focus on sampling inside a house to determine if those vapors are present. As also depicted on this figure, monitoring is being conducted in multiple groundwater bearing zones. We only find the TCE now in the shallowest groundwater zone at and around the site. A bit more on the project progress. We have collected a lot of samples out here. As you see here, 140 indoor air samples have been obtained. We've also collected 254 ambient air samples, or samples of the air outside. 512 groundwater samples have been collected. 150 soil gas samples, again, those samples from vapor monitoring points that look for the presence of TCE and other chlorinated chemicals of interest. 511 soil samples have also been collected during our assessment activities. So let's talk a little bit more about the groundwater assessment. The goal of our assessment is to look for the chlorinated chemicals of interest, specifically TCE, PCE, and some of the other breakdown products. Again, presence of a dot doesn't necessarily indicate the presence of TCE, just that a sample was taken there. We use this data to assist us in identifying those locations for indoor air sampling. This is a data-driven process. We evaluate the data that's collected and then propose additional locations so that we fully understand the extent of the TCE and other chlorinated compounds of interest in groundwater. This is done with DEQ and upon their approval. We work with them to identify those locations and then we execute the work. As mentioned earlier, we have installed 95 monitor wells in and around the site. The picture on the right shows the locations of both the permanent monitor wells and the temporary monitor wells. On the right, there are pictures of the equipment that we use, the drilling rigs that you might have seen in the community as we do our work. The status of our activities is we are nearly delineated, meaning that we understand where the TCE is present. What we have seen is that the areas to the east of the site in Aurora Park are delineated. The areas to the south are delineated, and we are still working on some of the areas in the north along the parish line between Grant Parish and Rapides Parish. A little bit more about the soil vapor assessment. Again, these are samples that are collected to look for the presence of the chlorinated chemicals of interest in the soil gas. These data assist us in selecting the houses that we use for sampling indoor air. Depicted on the right in green are the locations of the soil vapor monitoring points. The photograph on the upper right shows a soil vapor monitoring point and a monitor well with an ambient air sample being collected by them. Seeing one of these sampling devices near your house doesn't necessarily mean that there is TCE there, just that there is an area that has been or is being evaluated. This is also a data-driven exercise where we evaluate the data and then propose additional locations. DEQ works with us to identify the locations and approves our work. These activities are ongoing and we'll continue them until we fully understand the extent of the conditions at the site and around the site. A little bit more about our indoor air sampling program. The goal of our program is to identify vapor intrusion, the potential for vapor intrusion to occur, or that is the presence of the chlorinated chemicals of interest in a house or a structure. This process is also a data-driven, and we use a protocol developed with DEQ to identify those homes or structures where indoor air sampling should occur. We evaluate, as I said before, the groundwater data and the soil vapor data to do this. Once a home is identified, we use a technique of collecting the indoor air over a period of 24 hours. On the upper right is a picture of the SUMA canister, also on the lower left. The lower left is a canister within the house collecting air samples. These data are taken and submitted to an analytical laboratory for evaluation. Those data are provided to us, and we review them with DEQ on a routine basis. We also share that information with the homeowners. These activities are ongoing and will also continue until we fully understand the extent of the conditions in and around the site. Depicted on the figure are those locations where we have conducted the indoor air sampling. They are shaded in yellow. The yellow dots are locations where we have collected ambient air or outdoor air samples. 28-day ambient air samples were taken numerous times and were non-detect for TCE and the other chlorinated chemicals of interest. Also, ambient air samples over shorter periods of time showed either extremely low or no detections of TCE. We believe there is no health risk related to the ambient air surrounding the dresser site. These data help us understand the potential vapor intrusion condition. Once we have identified a chlorinated constituent of interest within a house, we have various mechanisms to fix the vapor intrusion condition or mitigate them. They are both short-term and long-term measures that we can take. We have at our disposal air purifiers, systems that can attach to the home's air conditioner system, and also systems that are in place under the home. These systems allow the vapor to be filtered from the air. So once the vapor is identified during an indoor air sampling, an air purifier is offered to the resident. To date, we have approximately 27 of these systems deployed in the community. We also look at these longer-term measures, such as the I-Wave air purification system and the subslab depressurization system. The subslab depressurization system prevents vapors from entering the house. It's much like a radon mitigation system, which some people may be familiar with. In addition to the assessment work, we are continuing our remediation efforts to clean up the TCE and other chlorinated chemicals of interest in the groundwater and soil gas. We have focused on soil vapor, and groundwater. For the soil, we have removed or excavated those soils which have shown high concentrations of TCE or other chlorinated chemicals of interest. The soils were removed and disposed of off-site at an appropriate facility. We also have conducted in-situ treatment of groundwater through the introduction of other material that eliminates or destroys the chlorinated chemicals of interest. The diagram on the bottom right depicts the injection or introduction of these oxidants into the subsurface and destroying the chemicals of interest. The picture on the upper right is of a soil vapor extraction system. Those remove the soil vapors, treat them at the surface, and then release clean air. These activities have been ongoing for some time, and they will continue until we remediate or clean up the groundwater conditions that exist. So looking ahead, again, the public drinking water systems are not affected due to the conditions that exist in and around the Dresser facility. We are committed to our efforts of monitoring and remediation or cleanup at the site. We're here to work with the community and our elected officials in the area and the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality and Department of Health. We do work cooperatively with them, and we appreciate everybody's assistance in this process. So for additional information, again, I would point you to the Pineville information line or the Dresser website at www.dresserpineville.com. We are committed to addressing any questions an individual may have. Contact the information line, and we will get a representative to respond to your concerns or questions within a 48-hour period. Again, I'd like to thank you for the time, and we appreciate the community support and the support of the state agencies in conducting this assessment. Thank you.
We will now be answering the questions received by LDEQ through the Dresser Community Meeting email address. The first question, once the contamination site has been delineated, will it be possible to control the spreading of the pollution, or are we looking at continual enlarging of the plume over the years?
Interim remedial action for the soil vapor, soil, and groundwater has begun on-site and soon will be incorporated into the off-site areas. The source area continues to be remediated through soil removal and chemical oxidation injections into the groundwater. Elimination of the source area stops the continual influx of TCE into the groundwater. This is synonymous to turning off the water when you identify a busted water line or a leak in your home. Once the delineation has been completed, plume-defining wells will be installed just down gradient of the edge of the groundwater plume. These wells will be monitored on a regular basis to verify that the plume is not expanding.
Does anyone see a problem with the Water District 3 water well being within a few feet of a major contamination zone?
The public water supply well number 5 is located very near the Dresser facility to the west, but it is screened at a much deeper zone, approximately 1,000 feet deep, while the contamination is limited to the upper aquifer, which is approximately 25 to 30 feet deep in this area. Double case monitoring wells are also installed near the source area into the next deeper aquifer in that area, which is approximately 50 feet deep, and have not shown contamination in the area. Furthermore, the Louisiana Department of Health has been sampling water well 5 for many years. The sampling results from that well for the past decade can be found in DEQ's EDMS system, and they indicate that TCE has never been detected there. LDH is in the process of changing the sampling protocol for that well from every 3 years to twice a year until the groundwater contamination at the Dresser facility has been fully mitigated.
Is it a possibility that the current injection wells located on the Dresser property are putting pressure on the groundwater and shoving contamination further off-site?
Answer to that is no. The typical radius of influence for these types of injection wells is less than 20 feet from the well.
When was the LDEQ aware of possible contamination?
DEQ was aware of possible groundwater contamination by a petroleum hydrocarbon when the Dresser facility reported a detection of total petroleum hydrocarbon in groundwater in the summer of 2012.
When did LDEQ receive confirmation showing the contamination?
Although DEQ was aware of the reported hydrocarbon in that summer of 2012, it was the receipt and review of the subsequent assessment results in the fall of 2013 that confirmed the contamination was a chlorinated hydrocarbon, TCE, and not the original reported petroleum hydrocarbon.
Why did the LDEQ wait to notify the community regarding contamination?
DEQ became aware that groundwater contamination had migrated off-site in the spring of 2016. Groundwater flow direction determined from on-site monitoring wells indicated a northeasterly flow direction towards the Marler Ford dealership, and the sample results in that direction indicated that. The sample result at the intersection of Highway 167 and Shreveport Highway showed a detection of 4,000 ppb of TCE. The DEQ became aware of off-site solid gas contamination in the Aurora Park subdivision from the vapor monitoring point data completed along Austin Drive and Aurora Drive in December of 2019. Those results were at a level that indicated a possible exposure issue to indoor air, at least in the area nearest to the facility along Austin Drive. Per LDEQ regulations, the department issued first notification letters to the entire Aurora Park subdivision, accompanied facility consultants and LDH personnel in a door-to-door canvass along Austin Drive to attempt to gain permission to sample indoor air at those residences.
When do you guys intend to test Kings Drive?
The results of the ongoing investigation drives the direction and location of additional samples to complete delineation. Recent sample results at the intersection of Cayley Road and Grays Creek Highway have showed levels of TCE that require additional sampling. Groundwater samples are scheduled to be collected along Grays Creek Highway to the west of Cayley Road and also along the northern portion of Kings Drive.
How long has the leak been active?
The source of the contamination has not been determined. The source area is in the southeastern portion of the Dresser property based on the sample results. That area is known to have contained former solvent degreaser tanks which were operated inside the building. Contaminated soils have been excavated within this area. Other possible sources could be spills during operations, contaminated wastewater discharges, and a possible underground storage tank that may have contained solvents. No tank, however, was found in this area during excavations and ground penetrating radar surveys.
Did Dresser know about this leak?
It appears that Dresser first became aware of the contamination during an excavation to repair a waterline pipe. There have been no reported leaks to the DEQ in the files.
A few questions were received regarding potential impacts to property values due to groundwater and soil gas contamination. LDEQ cannot address these issues. LDEQ's role is limited to the investigation and remediation of soil and groundwater contamination.